American Television with Mitchell Hadley is the name of our show. I'm Dan Schneider, your host. That's Mitchell Hadley. And we're going back to the basics of when we started the show a couple of years ago. And we're going to do another decade. Here we are moving into the 21st century. And I have to admit that compared to the earlier decades of which I lived in and the couple before, which I didn't, we're getting into this gray area where I sort of started moving away from television. I got bored with most television. I know some of the big names, the big shows, and whatnot, but this is where we're going to put more of it on Mitch's shoulders. So first, before we do so, Mitch, just give you a little bio for people who don't know you.
Sure, I am a classic TV historian and novelist. I have written about classic TV for nearly 16 years now. My website is itsabouttv.com. I have two books about classic television. The most recent is called Darkness in Prime Time, and it's a look at how classic era television shows foresaw the cultural descent into hell that we're living in today. And I have a new book coming out in June, which is a novel, has nothing to do with TV, and hopefully you'll find it just as entertaining.
So I know about 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago, you, I, and a couple of other people did a show talking about the so-called second golden age here that basically starts around this time, this decade. And I know I've always chafed against it. I've always thought there was a bunch of nonsense. Not that there weren't some good shows, but it didn't seem to me qualitatively to be any better. So before we actually get into the historical shows and what happened with them and why they were considered that way, I still think that we're talking about more marketing hype than actual quality, and I think if television presumably or whatever it merges into with online stuff is still around in say the year 2100, 3/4 of a century from now, I don't think people are going to see some, oh, here we had the Rocky Mountains in the 40s and 50s with live television. Then we went through Kansas for 40 years. Then we got the Himalayas of this cable age, and then we flattened out again. I think they're going to be a bit more realistic. What is your take now, a few years on from when we did that show?
Well, it is very interesting because I think I think that people are starting to excuse me. I think that people are losing the institutional memory of television in the first place. So the accomplishments in the past, no matter how good they may or may not have been, and the classic shows that we think of from the past, no matter where they really stack up, are becoming lost to an entire generation or two of viewers. So you're not able to make any kind of qualitative comparison of them that makes sense to most people. Yeah, if you take what you and I consider to be classic shows, historic shows, shows that have some real meaning to them, you're finding that it's not that people disagree with you, it's that they don't know. And when you look at the recency bias that dominates so much discussion about everything really, but television in this case, it is so dominant that aside from a few singular shows like I Love Lucy, it's very difficult to find any program from the 50s, the 60s, increasingly even up until the 90s that people can intelligently discuss or that they can compare to. So in a roundabout way to answer your question, when I was preparing my show notes for this program, I was looking at what's really outstanding about the decade, and what stands out more than anything else is technology and trends and changes. And you can see from a historical viewpoint, it's very significant in terms of what television is becoming. But when you start to break it down into individual programs and say, this was a great program, this wasn't, you find that you're redefining what great means or even what successful means. You're redefining it. you are doing so in such a way that the most successful shows dramatically or historically, let's say, the most successful shows aren't even necessarily the shows people are more familiar with. So you're not only not able to draw comparisons between particular eras, but you're not even able to draw comparisons between particular demographics anymore. Everything is starting to become so fragmented in the first decade of the century that you're already seeing difficulty in being able to see influential trends or really anything on an individual basis. It's almost the most significant things are almost entirely technology oriented.
Um, Before we get heavy into the decade, I don't know how much of a sports fan you are, but I see very similar arguments about modern day sports mirroring those of this golden age of the early 21st century, supposed in television. And it's mostly for the same reasons. I'll give you two sports examples. One is the endless Michael Jordan versus LeBron James, who's greater debate. And yet they always leave out Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They always leave out a Wilt Chamberlain. And it's like, they don't even know that. Or online, there's like, oh, Chamberlain never had a 100-point game. That's just a myth. It doesn't exist because there's no film of it. And in the similar way, in baseball, when people talk about Shohei Ohtani in the last decade and him pitching and hitting and, that he's the new Babe Ruth. But, Babe Ruth was back when you only had white guys who threw 70 miles an hour, which is untrue. Or in the NBA, Bill Russell and John Havlicek were just plumbers, part-time people and whatnot. And that echoes a lot of the sentiment I hear, because people who will talk about, the Big Bang Theory or How I Met Your Mother, I think is the title of another show. If you bring up a Norman Lear show, or if you bring up one of the MTM Mary Tyler Moore shows and say, well, these were great comedies, or The Odd Couple, or, any classic one that you want to bring up, they're like, oh, that was, we'd never have that all in the family. That wasn't really a great show. It was just people talking politics or whatnot. And so I see these same kind of dismissive attitudes for anything, basically from maybe the time the person who's speaking was born backwards.
Yeah, I think that you can look at, for example, at a show that I actually enjoyed, that I thought was pretty good. It's Gary Shandling's show. And when that came on, and even now today, you'd be hard-pressed to find people that remember it. But when it was on, people would talk about how, this is groundbreaking. Shandling's breaking the fourth wall. He's talking directly to the audience as if this had never happened before, when, of course, George Burns had done it in the 50s. And it was not uncommon, even going back to the golden age of radio, to have characters in character addressing the radio audience. So breaking the fourth wall has never been new, except to people who haven't experienced it before, and they have a tendency, because of that recency bias, the recency bias that I'm always talking about, they have a tendency to think that because they have just discovered it, nobody else has ever seen it before. And they also have this idea that new is always improved. So in the discussions about basketball players, like you were talking about, you can say, well, Chamberlain got 40 rebounds a game because they were lousy shots out there. Or Bill Russell was able to dominate and win so many titles because you only had 10 teams. They always find these outs. But rather than incorporating them into the discussion, they simply dismiss it out of hand. And they assume today's players are greater athletes, that because they are capable of doing more athletic maneuvers, that automatically means the game is better. Well, it doesn't. When you've got stars who are making 55% of their free throws and they're chucking up 3-pointers at a rate that almost bastardizes the quality of the sport, then you're simply saying that because it's new and because you're experiencing it, ergo it has to be the best. And this is what you run into, as you're saying, with TV. What really appalls me about this is not just this idea of recency bias, because again, unless you're a TV historian, a lot of what your knowledge is limited to is what you've experienced. But when you get articles online that are written by supposed TV experts, supposed historians, in which you can find blatant factual errors, not errors of opinion, but actual mistakes that they're talking about because they're just going off the top of their head, because they are taking their own experiences instead of looking at the entire history of the medium. You have people making these totally ignorant statements, and then those are picked up by other people, and it's spread that way until you build a consensus about it, and you find out that you find all these myths becoming fact. And when they become fact and they start to be what populates the Groks and the Chat GPTs and all these AI things, you're going to get garbage out just like you've got garbage in. And I think it's a direct parallel to something like that with sports. So you have all of these different categorizations. We'll get into a couple of them, but I'm just going to mention one just to wrap up this part of what we're talking about. Breaking Bad cemented the anti-hero era. That's a bullet point that I found in talking about it. Well, yes, it did, in the sense that you had somebody who was actually a criminal that is the main character and the character that you're supposed to have some sympathy with. But he wasn't the first anti-hero. And if you go all the way back to the days of The Fugitive with Richard Kimball, as a man on the run from the law, he was a prototypical anti-hero, not because he had done something wrong, but because he was challenging the accepted narrative, which was that law enforcement has to be trusted to make the right decision. So you have a policeman, the good guy 90% of the time, chasing him, and people are rooting against him. You have the legal system, which has completely failed in the case of providing justice for Kimball. You have the perfect setup for an anti-hero in challenging the established narrative. And yet when that happens in TV today, perhaps it's more blatant, but again, they're treating this as if it's something television has never, ever discovered until now.
But there's a fundamental difference between Kimball and the guy from Breaking Bad.
Yeah, the guy in Breaking Bad's a real crook.
Right, and he's a psychopath. I'll give you an example, because Kimball, in the however 100 episodes or whatever that ran there, we do see him doing some crimes in terms of assaulting people or doing this or doing something shadily in the ethics way. But that's what an anti-hero is. An anti-hero is not, as the TV trope says, a likable good guy, which is what Dexter is. I'll give you an example. I never heard of this show before, and it's a decade after this one. Have you heard of The Blacklist?
I have. I've never seen it.
Yeah.
I know enough about it so that I wouldn't sound like an absolute idiot at a party, but I'm not terribly conversant.
So James Spader, I think, is a wonderful actor, and the character is the main character is like an ex-Marine bigwig that falls into a life of crime, and then he's caught. He makes a deal with the government that he'll expose other criminals and whatnot. But the thing is, and the scenes of him talking is just wonderfully written dialogue, but it's totally unrealistic. The character himself is a definitional narcissist and psychopath that makes Trump look like a good guy in comparison. This is not an anti-hero that he's playing. This guy makes Dr. Moriarty look like a schoolboy too, and people just conflate, and it gets back to the whole thing about what is good is dark and grim and real, as if those are the only aspects of life that have quality. That's why you have Dexter's, and you have The Sopranos, and you have, even though he's not technically a crook, Don Draper is a totally repugnant person. But going back to Kimball. Kimball is actually a more realistic person than any of these characters. And
Exactly.
he's actually based on a real person in a real life case, the Sam Shepard case.
And so what you wind up with is that you've got a Walter White in Breaking Bad, and people call him an anti-hero, and they say that this solidifies the anti-hero era, when in fact he's not an anti-hero at all. He is somebody who appeals to your darker nature. And if you find yourself rooting for him, then you've left the heroic stance completely behind, and you're getting off into a different era. But people latch on to this anti-hero because they heard it somewhere, and because you have them in the past. They say that these shows typify an anti-hero when they're actually typifying something else, and they're normalizing behavior that in any other circumstance would be considered completely it would disqualify you completely from ever having anybody who is rational and sane rooting for you. So that becomes a total redefinition of what you're talking about, I would contend, through an ignorance of what the term really means. And as we slide into the decade of the 2000s, the point that you've made so well about dark themes and serious topics and very good writing can't offset the fact that what you're getting into is a completely different era of what TV used to represent. It appeals to our lesser nature in many ways. And in that sense, it begins to be seen as a perfect mirror of what culture today is like. Now, whether it has reflected it or caused it is another discussion, but this is what we've gotten into, where we have redefined quality to mean things we want it to mean in order to be able to continue the conversation to support what we believe in the first place.
And for those who say you have to be dark to be a great character, I give you Thomas Magnum, and before that I give you Jim Rockford. And if you think that drama only has to be dark and dealing with psychopaths, and they didn't do that in the past, I give you the best 20 or 30 episodes of the original the Hawaii Five-0. So let's though get back to the calendar here. So it's 1999 going into 2000, Y2K and all that stuff. We have the ending of Seinfeld. We have Friends basically in its heyday, just about midway through its run. Where does the sitcom stand?
Well, the popular narrative about the sitcom, which I think is true to a certain extent, is that what you're looking at are sitcoms that are evolving into something else. A different definition of sitcom than what you had before. When you talk about Seinfeld, you're right that Seinfeld, famously the show about nothing, is redefining your classic setup of what a sitcom is. And when you look at the successful shows from the first decade, you're talking about a show like The Office. It's not new in the sense that it's really just another import from the UK with an American cast and an American perspective. You can argue whether or not it's better than the original. I don't think it is. But what it's doing is creating this mockumentary style that's fairly new to television. So you can call it groundbreaking in that sense, that it's opening up a different type of TV. You've got a show like Arrested Development, which is a niche show. It's got a cult audience, but it's presenting comedy in a serialized way, which it has never really been before. You've had certain arcs within a comedy show where you might have a 2 or 3 part storyline going on, but this is kind of serializing the whole thing, and it's also presenting a layer of density You either get it or you don't. That is unusual with a successful sitcom. And by successful here, I'm just talking about multi-season. You've got shows like 30 Rock. You have the Will and Grace, which again is not the first sitcom to present gay characters, but it certainly is one of the first to standardize it within the regular cast and go into certain areas that would have been considered off limits in the past, or would certainly have gotten the kind of sponsor pushback and audience pushback that didn't really happen as much with this. So yeah, it always happens, but when you look at famous audience responses of the past, this is pretty mild compared to all of those. So I think what you've got with the sitcom is that you have comedies that are sharper, that they are very fast. There's a pretty even divide between shows that are traditional in the sense that they're witty, clever. A show like Frasier, for example, if you go back a little ways from there, Everybody Loves Raymond, and then you have shows that are more like 30 Rock, that are satires, Arrested Development, that are cult figure shows, How I Met Your Mother, which is unique in that it's one of the few comedy series that actually sets up a premise, not unlike something like The Fugitive. If ever there was a sitcom you could legitimately say had to have a final episode, it would be How I Met Your Mother, because that's what the entire series is pointed to. If that ever got canceled early in its run, it would have been a disaster. Now, there are people who would say the final episode was a disaster, but you see my point. So you're seeing an evolution of it. You're seeing the carryover from the 90s and the more traditional aspects of comedy, but at the same time, you're seeing it change slightly what the definition of a sitcom is.
From what I recall from 2 decades ago, sitcoms, the most successful ones were more based on the Friends formula. You had that 70s show. You had this Big Bang Theory, which also is about a lot of younger people, under 30 or crowd or whatnot. But it seemed to me that sitcoms, people talk about the pre-Cosby Show, early 80s as being a fallow period. To me, that was a fallow period too, because what stood out most to me was the reascension of game shows in the late 90s with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and then bringing back, old classics like Family Feud, and I think they brought the Pyramid Game back and a few others like that, and they'd have new hosts, usually minority hosts. And I have to say, the game shows of the 2000s were probably the most diverse portion of television out there, for good or ill. But it seems to me that both the game shows and then contest shows, most notably American Idol, dominated. I mean, American Idol, I think you had I think I Love Lucy in the 50s. The 60s was the Beverly Hillbillies, that was the big bully. The 70s was All in the Family. The 80s was Cosby. I guess you could call in the last 3 or 4 years, Seinfeld was the big bully. But then American Idol was the bulldozer that just dominated television. What do you think precipitated, I guess, quasi-real shows that these were? What precipitated their rise? Just because they were cheap to put?
Well, that's a big part of it. I think they were inexpensive to put together. They didn't depend on writers in the conventional sense. Now, anybody who thinks a reality show isn't scripted, I've got some Swampland I can sell you at a really good price, but they're not scripted in the traditional way. So economically, they make sense for a network. Yes, they are cheap. And they're also, in the beginning, they're also very successful. And nothing breeds excess like success. And so everybody starts copying the format, and to varying degrees. But when you have so many of them on there, it really becomes obvious that some of them are going to succeed when you're throwing so much at the wall. With something like American Idol, that's really just Star Search without Ed McMahon, and it's the Gong Show but played straight instead of satirical. It is the original amateur hour without spinning the wheel. There's nothing original about American Idol. But what it does do is capitalize on this incredible lust for celebrity that we have in modern culture. Not just the cult of the celebrity, which, it amazes me as somebody who's still of an age where you were very cautious as to whom you referred by their first name. That implied a certain level of familiarity. But now looking at the magazines in the grocery stores, at the checkout counters, apparently we're on a first name basis with everybody. You can mention any celebrity just by their first name. We're expected to know who it is. So you have that cult of personality, but you also have the individual thirst for stardom. And everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame. And as we see the 21st century go even beyond the 2000s into the 2010s and the 2020s, that opportunity to become a celebrity is becoming more and more real for a lot of people. You only have to have a modicum of talent. You have to have a certain personality, a certain way of presenting yourself that is going to appeal to other people. And if you have those things, and if you can catch lightning in a bottle, then there's no limit to where you can go in the short term. And I think that the what we can call the reality variety type of show capitalizes on that, whether it's American Idol or later on The Voice or some of these other things. Going all the way back, I suppose, to Evening at the Improv, you see this desire to watch other people trying to become a star because it convinces you might be able to do the same thing. And you see people trying and failing, which convinces you that you're better at this than they are, and that you'll succeed where they failed. And they're cheap. It always comes back to that. They're cheap and they're easy to make, and because it succeeded for one network, it can succeed for all of them.
Well, yeah, especially with American Idol, it's interesting to note that in its original Fox television run, which I think was 11 or 12 seasons, then it had a hiatus for about 4 or 5 years, and it's been back on for 8, 9, 10 years now on ABC. If I say the name Ryan, Ryan Seacrest, Paula, Paula Abdul, Randy Jackson, not of the Jackson 5, but a different Randy Jackson. And then, of course, Simon is
the breakout
Cowell, But try to name any of the winners. I mean, yeah, there's Carrie Underwood, who's a beautiful blonde, doesn't hurt to be that. Kelly Clarkson, who was the first one, so she's going to stick out a bit more. But after that, maybe I can think of Chris Daughtry, and he had a band who had 3 or 4 hits about 15 years ago. After that, I don't know. And so for all the claims about, they're going to get a record contract and they're going to get promoted like this, I think Carrie Underwood and Kelly, I think still has a TV show, interview show, although I think she's sub Oprah.
Who doesn't? Yeah.
She's sub Oprah. And Carrie Underwood, she's had her country hits, and she hosts the CMA Awards every year, it seems. And she's this generation's Shania Twain, I guess. But that's about it. And you think about 20 years of a television show, and you really have basically just 2 stars manufactured, whereas you had more than that just on the original panel.
Yeah. Well, you've got Warhol's 15 minutes of fame that everybody will have, and that seems to be good enough for a lot of people. And what I'm wondering about, just from a purely sociological standpoint, is I wonder about the people who have their 15 minutes of fame and then don't have it anymore. All they can ever say is that I once was, or I used to be. And, being a has-been presupposes that at one time you were somebody. Now you're not. And it seems as if we are so wrapped up in the idea of fame that we're even content with the idea of being a has-been, because it means that I wasn't always a has-been. I may not be anything today, but boy, I was. And I wonder what the long-term effect of that is once you realize that being a has-been is forever. If you don't get a second chance, there are no second acts in life. You look at the mess that things are in right now, and you wonder if that is part of it, the willingness to sacrifice your future, sacrifice the meaning of your life in order to get a short-term boost of fame that will, your the dopamine or whatever you want to call it, that'll carry you through your 15 minutes, and then it'll give you a little more to go on after the 15 minutes are over before reality comes crashing down. How do you get that high again?
Well, I know we talked the last time about Gary Moore and Carol Burnett becoming a star from his show. Uh, if you look back at the early talent shows, the Godfreys, and even if you look at variety shows like Ed Sullivan, or even you mentioned the Smothers Brothers a few times, how many people that were unknowns before then appeared on those shows and became stars? I mean, I know it's higher, but how much significantly more high is it than the last 15, 20 years
It
of these contests?
probably it's probably easier to quantify in terms of it seems like there were a lot more because you didn't have quite the balkanization of our culture that you do today.
Mm,
So I would argue, for example, that Carson was one of the biggest star makers,
yeah.
because if you were a comedian and you nailed it on Johnny's show and he invited you over to the couch, you had it made. But the difference is everybody knew Carson. They didn't all watch him, but they all watched what came out of that show. And so if you could make it on Carson's show, you could make it anywhere. And that isn't the case today. So you have fewer venues for somebody to go to once they've succeeded somewhere. If you have fewer venues, you have fewer opportunities, you have fewer eyeballs that are going to be tuned into you, you have less of an effect. As a result, you have fewer endorsement opportunities because, again, you're going to be talking about niche audiences. So I would argue that if you've got a show that is capable of star creation today, your stars automatically are going to be diminished by virtue of the way things are set up now. You simply can't be a star across the board anymore, except in extraordinary circumstances or cases of extraordinary talent. Because no matter where you are or what medium you are performing in or where you're seen, there's always going to be a chunk of the population that doesn't even recognize you.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between now and then, I think.
So I want to talk about public television because recently, under the Trump administration in the last year, public television and radio has been gutted, and I'm someone who recognizes the benefits of it, but by the same token, I've never been 100% supporter of it because I think that uh, all television would be better if it was in a BBC model. Public television by itself never got the great support anyway. But putting those arguments aside, I always found that at the turn of the century, PBS started getting stale. And by this time, Sesame Street was doing sort of a forerunner of what would happen to The Simpsons. I think they were starting to, you can only see Oscar the Grouch so many times. Big Bird, is can you really sustain 40 years of humor from a man in a giant bird outfit? Bert and Ernie. At this time, the only main thing people cared about was whether they were gay characters or not. They had lost their appeal as just childlike things, and so on and so forth. And in terms of the quality television that genuinely was on there, and there was the documentaries, shows like American Masters, American Experience, instead of doing the big stories of history. They started doing these sort of niche little things that did person A really compare to Dwight Eisenhower? We need to see a 3 hour documentary about a minor, underling in the civil service versus Ike or whatnot, whatever you think of Eisenhower. The Burns brothers did some good stuff in the 90s and on. In the 2007, Rick Burns' Into the Deep, I think, was a flat out great movie, a documentary about the Essex, the real life Moby Dick. But both of those brothers had their style, and you'd see other younger filmmakers aping that style. Am I alone in thinking that PBS was sort of running on fumes by the time we turned the century?
I don't think so. I think you're right about this because what's happening as you see public broadcasting become more dependent on certain levels of funding that are justified by the ratings because they're competing with other types of entertainment for the dollar. As you're seeing them lose some of their government funding, they're having to fall back on shows that are more popular, more ratings friendly. So you're constantly getting shows where they're featuring aging rockers and frankly things that are appealing to the older demographic that PBS has. Now, this isn't to say that it is not entertaining, but what it is completely the opposite of what public broadcasting was initially set up to be, which was to provide well-rounded content to address niche audiences and interests and to take chances with experimental broadcasting, with doing things that the networks were afraid to do. Now, you saw that in the early days of public broadcasting, not just in, I'll just give you one brief example because I could talk about this for hours, but there's when back in the days when PBS was still NET, National Educational Television, they had NET Playhouse and they had NET Opera. And yes, you've got opera on TV. You even still have it on PBS today when they're doing their live from Lincoln Center Metropolitan Opera ones. But those are very conventional, traditional, popular operas in many senses. NET, by contrast, would put on they would have operas like Lizzie Borden, the story of the famous murderess or non-murderess. They had the trial of Mary Lincoln. They had very avant-garde operas. They had theater that was very unconventional, very experimental. They weren't shows that would attract a large audience, but they would attract an audience that was pleased that what they enjoyed was being shown. By the 2000s, I think this is gone, or at least it's fading away. They're having to take fewer chances. They're having to rely more on funding that is going to go to proven quantities. So Masterpiece Theater is good. Masterpiece Mystery is good. But something that is more, let's take a chance on this, more unconventional, that's not good because how many people are going to see it and what kind of a return are you going to have on your investment? When you see what's on shows like Masterpiece Theater, how many of them are new dramas and how many of them are for example, part 13 of this or that or the other? You're going to have the 8th series of Inspector Morse, or you're going to have the 7th series of Downton Abbey, if you start mixing the decades. Those are good shows, but every time you create, or every time you continue a series, or every time you reboot one, and I'm trying to keep track of how many different Maygrays they've had, how many different Inspector Dalglishes they've had, or Lord Peter Wimseys they've done. You can say that you're making a different approach to telling some of these stories, but it's also stale, in your word. It's not doing anything new or different. And I think that even the audiences for these shows who love them are starting to look in the 2000s at these and saying, this is getting a little formulaic. This is actually getting a little dull. And then you compare it to the quality, the prestige drama that you're seeing on cable or on HBO, and it's falling short. So I think that what we're seeing is, if you want to put it in these terms, what you're seeing is the solidification, the institutionalizing of PBS as a comfortable, safe alternative that doesn't take a lot of chances, finds what its audience wants and continues to provide it, and doesn't really work that hard to find a new audience except in certain areas. The Burnses are a great example. I think that for New York, Rick Burns series, I love that. I thought that was terrific.
Yeah.
When I watch it again, it's still terrific, but I have to ask myself if New York City really deserves all of that attention. Same thing with Ken Burns and baseball.
Yeah.
Baseball, the first time around, was pretty good. But in fact, there are plenty of documentaries about baseball that can cover the terrain that Burns did in about 2 hours and really give you a better overview of the history of the game. He might be able to center in on something which he thinks has significance, and he hammers on it and hammers on it, but it doesn't really do any good. And yet, because he's Ken Burns, and because the PBS audience has become accustomed to the idea that longer is better, that means that if you're spending 16 hours on a topic or 12 hours on a topic, it must be the definitive version of that topic. It's going to give you things that you haven't seen before, because how else could you fill the time unless you're doing something that's new and different? And when you start to define different and experimental simply in terms of length, then you get stagnation.
Well, it's also, I think, the reliance on non-American drama. For
Mm-hmm.
example, uh, Upstairs, Downstairs was sort of PBS's equivalent in the 70s to Roots. I mean, it came a year or two
Yep.
before. You had I, Claudius, if you want to talk about experimental there. That certainly pushed the boundaries. And then if you want to talk like prestige drama, you go a few years later, even into the early 80s or mid 80s with Anne of Green Gables for children, although it's still adults can enjoy it too. That was high quality. And the shows seemed to fall off. They fell into the Britcom mold
Yeah.
that we're just gonna bring in a Britcom that was mediocre there, and we can sell it as high prestige in America. But getting back to the original stuff with NET, I remember, I guess it must have been about, might have been the 10th year anniversary of the founding of PBS, which would have probably been in 78 or 79. I guess I was 12 or 13 at the time.
Yeah.
And I remember they would do a history. I guess National Educational Television was maybe 20 years old then, or 10. But anyway, it was some kind of celebration of the thing. And they rebroadcast a concert of John Cage music. Now, if you know John Cage music,
Mm-hmm.
it's not particularly musical, but it was still there, and it was something only PBS would do, or
Precisely.
maybe the occasional like city university kind of channels might have done something. The other two that we've talked about before, Meeting of Minds with Steve Allen, is
Yep.
something that only would have been done on PBS. And on the kids level, if we talk about Sesame Street, if Sesame Street was the safe alternative, the less safe alternative came a couple of years later with the Electra Company. You have Rita Moreno, this Broadway superstar, hey you guys, screaming to open the show. I mean, it announced itself like no other show in television history, and it took chances, and it brought shows like Zoom took chances,
Mm-hmm.
shows like the Big Blue Marble took chances, and when I've looked, and Mr. Rogers, of course, too. When I look at shows from the '90s and O's, and even today, you replace Mr. Rogers with Daniel the Lion, one of Mr. Rogers' character, but now he's a cartoon character,
Right.
and he's basically a Teletubby. Uh, it's a totally different character. It's in a totally different universe, but it shows the utter difference. And we're probably at the turn of the century, at the midway point of this slide. And it's just so disappointing because, yes, it still was, on the whole, I'd say, better than most American television around the turn of the century. But it clearly, I'm sorry to say, it clearly failed to live up to its aspirations.
Well, interestingly enough, if you look back at even to NET, there were concerns being expressed by some of the larger public television stations in the late 60s that they were beginning to voice concern that NET was becoming too dependent on British programming. And they were looking at the early things, not just Masterpiece Theater, but even some of the miniseries that predated that. The first Churchills, for instance, while they were acknowledging that these were good, they were warning that the network was becoming overly reliant on imported shows, and they were failing to develop domestic programs that were made by some of their own affiliates or that could be made. So when you look at a show like The Addams Chronicles, which PBS showed during the bicentennial year, it was one of the landmark shows. People don't remember it a lot now, but it was one of the landmark shows that PBS had in those days because it was completely American made. It had an American cast, American settings, and it was telling a quintessentially American story about one of the great families in American history. And for a network that had become so identified with British television, even in its syndicated shows, something like The Addams Chronicles was quite unheard of. And that could have been an opportunity to get more into some of the things that you're talking about, but it didn't happen. And so I think you're absolutely right that not only did they not capitalize on the opportunity to take advantage of that experimental level, but they also missed two complete genres, if you will, that could have improved public broadcasting in the 2000s. One of them is American-made programming. And again, WGBH is a co-producer with the BBC on some of these shows. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about WGBH doing an all-American type of show. They're missing out on that, and they're missing out on the great body of American literature that could be adapted to this kind of programming. One of the complaints that I often had about masterpiece mystery, let's say, is that they're all British mysteries. Well, of course they are, because they're coming from a British point of view. But even once you start introducing characters like Wallander, where the Scandinavian noir idea, where are the Raymond Chandlers? Where are the Dashiell Hammetts? No genre is perhaps more closely identified in literature with the United States than the American hard-boiled private detective story. And they could have done an entire series made in America with American actors and American scripts from American detective fiction, and they never pursued it. And that's one of the things that I think comes home to roost. When you don't take chances, when you have a very narrow field that you work within, well, of course you're going to get stale because you're never reaching outside of that envelope.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was trying to get to say about shows like American Masters or American Experience. Those are the kinds of shows you really can't do. I think that on a regular series basis because what you end up doing is if you have a series, even if it's a short one of 13 episodes, you maybe have 4 or 5 episodes that are about really great artists or about really important events, and then you have a 2-hour exploration about the evolution of wheat, or something like that. And it's not against weed. Or you have, we're going to do an in-depth documentary about Gummo Marx. Incidentally, Gummo Marx was the only Marx brother who never made a film. But he's a fascinating character. It's like, you know.
He's fascinating because we say so. Well, I think you've really hit something there, because what it does is it goes a little bit to that Burns tendency to try to find a hook in every era or in every story, to find a hook and play with that hook for as long as possible and to thread it through the entire documentary, whether it is historically significant and important or not, if it makes for good storytelling. Sometimes with a series like American Masters or The American Experience, which I still enjoy when I get a chance to watch some of them, instead of simply acknowledging that some stories are more interesting than others and thus are worthy of more time, they take all of them at the same level of importance. So the Triangle Factory fire is worthy, and it is worthy of a documentary, and it bears going into, and it has great cultural and historical significance, but it has a level of significance that is different from other events. It may be less significant than some and more significant than others. And when you try to put all of them into the same category and give them the same treatment, you're going to shortchange some of them. You're going to spend way too much time on weak. And what they've never really figured out, I think, in that sense, is that one size does not fit all. Not every story deserves 13 episodes or even 4. Some of them only need a 2-hour movie. Some of them need a 1-hour documentary. You don't have to make a cottage industry out of it. And that, we won't get into this now because we're starting to get into a really interesting area that deserves more than just a touch on, which is the idea of intellectual property. But what PBS is doing, what all of the networks are doing, is trying to leverage their current existing intellectual property instead of looking for something that is new and different. And when you start to do that because of economic reasons and because you're guaranteed a certain level of ratings, then your creativity goes right out the door. What happens when you launch a new season of NCIS Omaha, or NCIS Paducah? Yeah. Instead of trying something different, you just try to franchise it. You just play with your intellectual property, and you do something that I think we'll see when we start to talk about drama. The franchising of television begins in the 2000s, where you start to spin off not characters, but genres.
Yeah, I think the major problem with PBS, and we'll move on in a moment here, the major problem that was manifesting itself at the turn of the century, the turn of this decade, and if had been addressed, it wouldn't have mattered what the government did or what a Trump administration would have done, because there was too much of a comfort level. There was too much of a creative comfort level. The PBS people, they had established by that time a 3+ decade brand as quality in America, quality in American TV, intellectual television. And instead of leveraging that to go to people like maybe a Jerry Seinfeld after his show ended, or maybe to someone from the past, or someone connected with, let's say, maybe the Archive of American Television, and finding some people and doing interesting interesting shows about certain things. And I'll give you an example that I'm thinking of. Because if they had done this, if they had gotten away from being wholly dependent upon government subsidies, they could have given the middle finger to the government and say, okay, you're only 15% of our funding. We can find that. But about a year ago, I saw something online that I had seen back probably in the 1980s, which was probably the last flick of real creativity in that decade for the PBS. And that was, of all people, Gabe Kaplan from Welcome Back, Kotter, doing a one-man show or actually at the end, technically it wasn't, but 90% of a one-man show about the life of Groucho Marx. And it was written by one of Marx's biographers, put on PBS. This is maybe 82 to 85 at the latest. And it's a very good play. It's very interesting. And you don't have to be a Groucho Marx fan to find it interesting. Is it the greatest play ever made? No. Does it have a flaw here or there or two? Was Gabe Kaplan the best actor to be doing Groucho? Probably not. But it was a good, daring piece of television for the few warts it may have had. By the turn of the century, they're not doing things like that. But imagine if Jerry Seinfeld had come along and said, I can't get this idea on NBC. They told me, you're a has-been, Jerry. Or similar to people that we've mentioned in the past, people if Carol O'Connor or other people who had been stars goes to PBS and says, I always wanted to do... Carol O'Connor, let's say, I always wanted to do a show about Mutiny on the Bounty, but set it in a stage setting, not big fancy effects or whatnot, stuff that's for the budget. Or I wanted to do a Sam Spade book or whatnot, but they weren't wise enough to leverage their prestige brand to get people who may not have been A stars anymore, but to do things that were daring. I would have gotten people like John Sayles or John Cassavetes. Imagine if John Sayles or John Cassavetes and say, you know what, you're probably sick and tired of struggling. Why don't we sign a 10-year contract for every film you want to do, John Sayles, over the next decade, and premiere it on PBS? Because you're not going to make money, but you'll have the prestige factor. Or if John Sayles, if he came to us and said, I have an idea of something like The Twilight Zone, but maybe it's not metaphysical like Rod Serling. Maybe it's about whatever. And you get the Saleses, you get the Cassavetes, these kinds of people, you recruit them in. Someone like a Quentin Tarantino, for all of his success and fame, probably would have loved to have done something for PBS. And it would probably be far different than the Burns brothers. And not to slag on them, but... That failure, I think, is the thing that has led to PBS's current crisis.
And would they even be able to do that now? Would they be able to leverage a prestige they don't necessarily have anymore? They had an opportunity. You're right. They missed it.
So before we talk about the dramas and the Golden Age stuff, I want to talk about two other categories: television news, but first TV movies. And I know we did that with a gal named Amanda Reyes a few years ago, talking about television movies. That was her métier. Yeah. But that and also the miniseries were pretty much dead. I mean, I know they've resurrected quote unquote miniseries that run 2 or 3 episodes, here and there on cable television. But were they dead even by the time the new century started, or what?
What you saw with movies, I think you saw an evolution of them from being these particular types. If you go back in time with the made-for-TV movie, you're right. ABC always had their reputation for going for new and unique topics, and they would take chances, and they would do a lot of supernatural stuff. And the networks dabbled in that kind of thing. But now, as you get into the 2000s and the specialty channels that you have out there, like the Hallmark Channel or Lifetime, you've got this entire genre of movies, these romance movies or these Christmas movies that have migrated to cable as a result, where they're shown all the time. And because of that, you don't have such an emphasis on having movies on the networks. The movies that you do have, you don't have the premieres of great theater movies on television anymore, because people can go on HBO or they can go on there to another cable station and they can see them uncut, uninterrupted, and that's the way they want them. So the big screen movie going to television, to commercial television, is a thing of the past. What else you're seeing is that you've got these issue movies, event movies, where it may be a very important movie or a very important subject. And that's the kind of thing that you'll see on network television. But otherwise, I think what you're really seeing is the migration of movies to cable and the lessening of them on network TV, and the miniseries as being, as you pointed out, more properly thought of as a two-part movie, because it's not a mini series anymore. It's just an extended movie. And or you'll get a multi-part adaptation of a book that might start with the book, but then take the characters and expand it beyond the material that was in the book, make a whole series out of it. But does that appear on network TV? Not so much in the 2000s. You're seeing that go to prestige pay TV and niche cable.
Yeah, and Hallmark.
Yep, which is a whole different category there.
Yeah.
But you're right. That why do you worry about getting a movie on network television when you can go to the Hallmark Channel or Hallmark Movies or Lifetime Movies or any of these other specific movie channels that are used to, getting out 10 movies a month ad infinitum, and then just recycling the same movies that they've shown over and over and over again. It's kind of the PBS syndrome in that sense, is that they find their niche and they establish it and they have their audience, and the audience doesn't care if they're seeing the same movie 50 times because they love it, and they don't care that every movie is essentially the same story with a different setting and different actors because they love the genre. So I think you're seeing a decrease in creativity on the networks, and you're seeing a migration of the movies to cable. Now, what you do still have left can be pretty good, but it isn't very much.
So as we record now, it is February 2nd, 2026, and one of the more interesting little stories in the news outside of Trump and AI doomerism and global warming catastrophes is the kidnapping of an elderly woman who is the mother of a television news personality or anchor named Savannah Guthrie, a name I barely knew before this.
Yeah.
And it's a sad story and whatnot. But it got me thinking, I barely know her name. Is she an anchor? And I think she's on NBC.
On the Today Show, as I recall.
It's the Today Show? Okay. But if I go back 25 years to the turn of the century, Peter, Tom, Dan, we know who they are. That's totally gone. There's the guy, I think on ABC, what's the name, David Muir, who I've always thought is just a big tall mannequin. There's is the black fellow Lester Holt? Is he the guy on NBC?
I think so. I think they have a succession plan, but if I'm not mistaken, he's still on there.
And then who? I think there's a female lead on CBS News, I guess. But
so up until recently, they've got another new anchor on there now with the change in the regime.
It's literally been 2 or 3 years since I even last watched that. I get my news from various outlets. But there you had, and they had their personalities, whether you liked them or hated them. Dan was the kooky one who would come up with a saying and then drill it into the ground for 6 months till he got his next weird saying. Peter Jennings was the slick Canadian who never showed any real emotion. Tom Brokaw was the greatest generation. He was the cheerleader for America. And whether or not that is an ideal position to be in, which I don't think it was compared to where we were back in the 60s or 70s with the Cronkite and the NBC News Huntley Brinkley report and so forth. It still seems that it's better than where we are now because CBS has been taken over by Trumpers, and it's maybe not quite as bad as Fox News. MSNBC is now MS Now, whatever the fuck that is supposed to mean. CNBC was NBC, ABC. Is CNN even still around, or is Ted Turner?
Surprisingly, it is still around. Yeah.
I have no idea. What what was the state of the news then and now, and where did we go wrong?
There is a definite BC and AD time, I think, with television news. BC is September 10th, 2001, and AD is everything that happened after September 11th. People may find this hard to believe now, but there was a time at the beginning of the century, in the year 2000, when breaking news meant a news bulletin. It didn't mean here's the top story we're covering at the moment. If you came on with breaking news, you were going to be scaring the hell out of somebody at home.
Yeah, it was JFK, Challenger disaster,
Yep.
or something like that.
Oh yeah, you had the skip of the heart if you saw breaking news. You did not have a ticker on there unless it was running the stock market quotes, because there was no need for it. So what happened in the decade of the 2000s is that news evolved into a permanent 24-hour cycle where there's no time to react, there's no time to reflect. It's just all news all the time, and it isn't even new news, as we see with the Guthrie story. It's just the same story being pounded at us hour after hour with very little change in it. This all started in the 2000s. Not that you might not have been able to see some of it creeping in before that, but I think that the one single thing about the decade of the 2000s that changed television the most is the way the news changed. Cable became the predominant place to see the news, because once you have established the fact that the news is happening all the time, then the only place to find out what's going on is a station that only shows the news all the time. People of our age might remember that the major networks didn't even have weekend news until the mid-60s on a regular basis, and even into the early 70s. I can remember one of the networks introducing their weekend news with a commercial that said that news doesn't take the weekend off. Things happen no matter what day of the week it is. That was not always the mentality. So if you create a demand for news, and if you don't have the news to fill the demand, you create the news. But if you create that demand for news and you convince people that it's happening constantly, then the only place you can depend on it is an all news network. That's the biggest difference. Now, from that, I think you have other things that evolve. You have the whatever you want to call it, debate television. That's what they call it in sports terms. When you have an issue like the one you said, is LeBron the greatest of all time? You can sit down and people just shout at each other across the table. Now that started in a very genteel way with something like 60 Minutes, when you had the last segment of the show where Shayna Alexander and James Kilpatrick would debate an issue.
Point counterpoint.
Yeah, you had the McLaughlin Group, which was entertaining as well as talking about the issues. There was shouting going on, but it was entertainment primarily as much as it was informative. You'd have somebody saying, John, you're wrong, and I'll tell you why you're wrong. And then he would proceed to do just that. But now debate television has become a blood sport with a zero-sum game at the heart of it. It's mortal combat between two different sides with no room for any kind of discussion or any kind of real analysis of what's going on at all. You have anchors who are really not impartial journalists. They're more advocates for one side or the other. And so at least a part of their job is to take sides during the debate, or at least to frame the debate in the terms that they are most comfortable with. So you don't have that level of objectivity. You have the idea that every car chase has to be shown, every murder has to be broken down. Everything that used to be unusual becomes the norm. And it leads to people questioning whether or not things are really as bad as they may seem, because they've become accustomed to how the news media blows everything up to fill the available space. And again, this gets into other aspects of it where you talk about whether or not people should be worried about certain events, whether they tune it out automatically because they've just gotten so cynical about the hype and therefore they aren't paying attention and they can be taken advantage of, or whether people are making things out to be worse than they actually are because they need the content to fill and because they need the conflict to be able to sell. So you've got this whole model of how the news is being presented now that someone like Fred Friendly is probably spinning in his grave looking at what has happened to news coverage. Even anchors like Huntley and Brinkley or Cronkite, who had their share of controversy and had their share of accusations that they were presenting biased news, would literally be vomiting, I think, to see what has happened to some of this. And I think that a lot of this has its real generative roots in the 2000s, and it is perhaps one of the worst things that we have seen come from that decade.
So I think in that decade, one of the big controversies was Dan Rather versus George Bush regarding, I think, was it medical records or service records?
Yep.
And it was whether or not a certain keyboard on a certain typewriter in the late 60s or early 70s could do a semicolon or something like that, right? Or was it just a font that was developed 25 years later in the late 90s or so? And
something like that.
Yeah, and as far as I recall, it was pretty much a wash. Some experts said no, others said it could under certain circumstances, and I don't think Rather apologized, but he had to admit that there was some doubt in the report. Now I fast forward to the last month or so, and we have this death of Nicole Good in Minnesota with the ICE folks going up there. This is a woman who tried to move her SUV when she was stopped by two ICE officers. One of them goes in and shoots her like 3 times dead right in the face. And we saw on the network news virtually nothing about different angles. I remember of what was seen. We only saw what the Trump administration wanted people to see. Now, regardless of how you feel about Trump or against Trump or indifferent, there's something wrong when you're getting these multiple angles from people, and it's organizations I never heard of. One, an online organization that I have heard of called Midas Touch Network, showed some of it. They did it from something called the Coup. A group of reporters, independent reporters, actually going out and contacting the people who are on that block who were taking things with their phones. Something which NBC, CBS, ABC did not do for like 2 weeks. And I'm thinking, there is no way, even putting aside journalistic ethics, there's no way that the major network newscasts or local newscasts would not have been on this story. If it leads, it bleeds. They would have. This would have been a perfect opportunity to score ratings and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But now there's such ennui in the network news. They don't even want to do the minimum work. So it's not that they're biased so much; it's that they're lazy as shit.
They've abrogated their duties to independent journalists who are reporting online, for better or worse, whether they're covering stories well or not. They are covering them, and that's something that the media today doesn't seem to be interested in doing. You're right. And what's interesting about this is that if you're like me and you spend a lot of time looking at the archives of magazines like TV Guide, what you can see is that one of the seminal events in the history of television news in the United States is the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Now, this show is not about that. Maybe we should do one someday about it, but
Yeah.
this show isn't about that. But what it is, if you look at it as a talisman, or at least the canary in the coal mine, into 1969, months, year or two after the convention, there is still this very public agony that is going on within the media and within media observers as to what happened at that convention. What happened to the media coverage? What does it tell us about the media? And what does it tell us about the way they cover special events? So that was a seminal event in the history of TV news. And I think that what we're seeing today is eventually it's got to be seen in the light of that as the continuation, the evolution of it, the idea of whether or not the media presents a view of what is going on that is consistent with the facts, whether the media have become advocates, whether the media have lost their objectivity. You know, one of the things about the Rather story, if I'm remembering, or it could be another Rather story. Dan was never at a loss for creating these kinds of things. But one of the questions that came up with one of the Rather stories, and I want to say that it was the one about Bush, but I could be mistaken, is a question of whether or not the network held on to the story and chose to release it at a point in time where the Bush campaign would not be able to mount an adequate counter response in the time remaining before the election. And as we've seen early voting expand over the years since, that time obviously gets pushed even farther and farther back to where you can have a story break quite some time before the election, but still after people have had the opportunity to vote, so it becomes an irrelevant story. The question is, when you start to look at the ethics of how and where and when you release a story, then you're essentially saying that the media is taking sides. And you're saying that they are trying to use the information they have to manipulate an event. Now, this is not the same thing as saying that the story itself is fabricated or that they're even shading the story. But what they are doing is shading the presentation of that story to affect a certain outcome. This was starting to take place long before the 2000s, but now that we are into the cable era and we have got three clear cable networks, we have Fox, the conservative network, we have MSN, the liberal network, and we have CNN, the formerly liberal network, which is now trying to position itself as the moderate network, even though many people still consider it a liberal network. You have each of them becoming almost like newspapers used to be, where you could identify every newspaper in a city or in a state by their editorial stance as to whether they were considered a Republican paper or a Democrat paper. Now you have the same thing happening on television. This didn't start in the 2000s, but it became entrenched in the 2000s, so that by the year 2009, you without question have these three networks, all with an ideological basis, all with a slant to their stories, all determined to present these stories in a way that complements their attitude toward it, and all being presented by presenters who double as commentators, who present commentary that's not labeled as such, who have shows that purport to be talking about issues of the day, but that are in fact based on the host's personality and his own political bias. And so what you have is not just a loss of objectivity, not just a loss of journalistic ethics, but it hits right to what you were talking about just a moment ago about laziness. It's much easier to put somebody in front of the camera and have them spout off with an opinion that they already have developed on a story they've already looked at, instead of taking a serious look at a variety of stories, digging under the surface, doing some actual journalistic work, and then reporting the results of that investigation, letting the chips fall where they may, good or bad, not worried about the sponsors, not worried about the after effects, but just trying to get the story out there, and if nothing else, allowing the story itself to be the source of debate rather than everything else that is going on. Again, what does this have to do with the topic of this show? It's that this became the model for news during the decade of the 2000s.
Yeah, and I think a very overused phrase is slippery slope. But in this case, TV news, I think when people talk about the slippery slope of something, this is a good example of where it is a genuine thing, because I can't imagine in the Rather Jennings Brokaw era that if a television or if a president or an administration came to one of their networks, what the destruction of 60 Minutes integrity recently too, that they would have said, get out of here. We're the fourth estate. You may be the president, but we are the guardians of the public interest. And it wouldn't have even been a question. I can't imagine if Eisenhower had tried to do something Trumpian. I mean, the blowback from the Murrows and the Cronkites and whatnot would have been a disaster for that president. But because little by little, this, you chip away at something, and it's again like with PBS and talking about losing their prestige and not being able to use it to gain some measure of independence creatively. In the same way, television news has lost its way because it has allowed itself to go down that slippery slope.
Yep, it has. Well, when the network news used to be 15 minutes long, and both CBS and NBC expanded their evening news to a half an hour in 1963. It was before the Kennedy assassination. But in commemoration of the fact that the two networks were expanding their news to the heretofore unheard of length of 30 minutes, President Kennedy did one-on-one interviews with Cronkite to air on CBS, and then with Huntley and Brinkley to air on NBC. During the interview with Huntley and Brinkley, Kennedy gave an answer to a question, and then he asked them to stop the film, and he said, I think I can give a better answer to that. Can we do that again? And I can do a better answer. And they did, and that was what they showed. And Huntley said, while his first answer was just fine, his second answer was even better. And that didn't qualify as a scandal, and nobody made anything of it. In fact, Huntley himself shared the story during the assassination coverage as a mark of not only his relationship with Kennedy, but as some insight into Kennedy the man. Now, you could argue that this was something of a slippery slope. I think it's so benign that it almost doesn't qualify. But what it does do, and what we probably ought to be aware of, is that it presents the idea that the interview that you're seeing on TV is not necessarily the entire interview. You're seeing an edited version of it. In this case, it was edited for a fairly minor point, perhaps, but it was edited in such a way that Kennedy's answer came across better than the original answer did. So that's kind of what opens the door to accusations and counter accusations when somebody says, well, you're editing my my interview in such a way that it's not presenting the real the real story of things as they happened. Now, to your point, if the media had the guts, and if the media was really interested in something like this, there's a very simple alternative to this. They just say, fine, let's do the interview live. then there won't be a chance to do any shenanigans at all. We go on the air at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. You be here. We'll be there in the Oval Office 10 minutes before. We'll sit down. We'll talk about a couple of things, and at 6:31 we go on live. That would be a very easy way to get around the whole thing. But does that mean more work? Does it mean that you can't capture the right side of the anchor as he's talking about it when he wants to be seen this way and he's going to be seen this way instead? When it becomes all about presentation and style, then you lose the substance altogether.
Yeah, and just though by mentioning that anecdote about needing or wanting to give a better answer, you also mitigate that because it's showing the fallibility of the person too, and it's important to show that thing as long as they state that. But let's get to the meat of this show probably, and that's the dramas. We've talked about a little bit about cable television in this show and also in earlier shows. So I'll let you just open up with however you want to open up about the state of dramatic television in the first decade.
Well, there was a phrase that was coined during the 2000s, the prestige drama. And it's also been referred to as a second golden age or a platinum age. But I think what people are most accustomed to hearing is the idea of a prestige drama. And the prestige drama in the 2000s has some very specific qualities to it. Number one, it's not likely to be on a network. It might be, but it's more likely that it's going to be on a pay cable service, specifically HBO, or it's going to be on AMC, one of the basic cable channels. It is going to be serialized so that the story will continue throughout a season and that the seasons will continue one into another, that it's going to deal with a very dark topic that we've talked about already, that it's going to have an ambiguous hero or series of heroes, that it is going to, in the case of Mad Men, look at a particular time in history and try to draw parallels between that time and our own time, or to highlight differences between that time and our own time, and that it is going to have copious, if not slavish, amounts of nudity, profanity, and other things that heretofore couldn't be shown on broadcast television. But they now gain a cachet because you can actually do it. Whether that means it's gratuitous, well, I mean, TV's always been gratuitous, but these are the kinds of things that are so typical of the dramas of the 2000s. And, if you look at the most highly regarded dramas, I think you look at The Sopranos, which started in 1999, but it became a cult phenomenon throughout the 2000s. There you have a very ambiguous central character. The mafia, of all of the bad guys that you have, the mafia is one of the few areas, I think, where you actually have some wiggle room to argue that a character could be an anti-hero. Because if you watch the Godfather movies, you will find certain occasions where what the Godfather and his henchmen are doing are actually defensible if you adopt a certain idea, as opposed to the pathological anti-hero who is an egomaniac and is mentally imbalanced and is doing everything out of a sense of sheer survival. There are actually some types of questions, ambiguous questions, that are involved with the mafia. So The Sopranos is a very interesting example. Then you've got a show like The Wire, which is bringing a completely different idea of a police procedural. It's very urban, for one thing. It is presenting some some really gray aspects as to what it's like to be in law enforcement in the modern day. There are no purely good guys or bad guys. You have uh, aspects of it that certainly have been alluded to in television before. Homicide: Life on the Streets, a show like that, has certainly brought up the idea that you have moral ambiguity. But The Wire raises it to a different level, and it actually has some cops who are crooks. But you have all the different facets of things coming through, and it's also heavily serialized. You have Mad Men, which we talked about, which looks at an entire industry and looks at how it influenced what we live in today. But it does so with some characters who seem to be almost universally unlikable to one stage or another. My experience with it is that there are no good guys in that. There are simply bad guys who are really bad and bad guys who aren't quite as bad. But then you also have, so that's one thing you have. You have the prestige drama. Then you have something that you are more likely to see on network television, which is the police / legal procedural. So you have shows like Law and Order, you have NCIS, you have CSI. You have shows that are dominated to one extent or another by the procedure itself and the fascination that that carries with an audience they're interested in not just knowing who done it, but how you know who done it. And the personalities are there, but they sometimes take a secondary role to the actual science of solving the crime. Other times, the main characters are seen not for what they do in investigating the crimes, but what they do away from work. And all of them apparently seem to have so many hang-ups of one kind or another that I've joked occasionally that I'm not sure whether they're there to make us feel better about ourselves, that we're not quite as crazy as they are, or what. But that's a subgenre within this, is the idea of the flawed hero and the hero being supposedly fully rounded, so that you see that their life away from the job is just as important, if not more important, than their life on the job. And then you have, I think, an area like, I would call Sex in the the City a show like this, or Six Feet Under. These are these shows that are edgy intentionally. Sex in the City is often considered a comedy, but it takes some very serious issues. A show like 6 Feet Under is a niche type of thing that's talking about genre things. I don't think they don't fit into the prestige category, but they are still, I think, too extreme to be thought of as something you would see on commercial television.
Well, I need to just ask, because I never saw 6 Feet Under. Is this about grave robbers? What?
Well, 6 Feet Under, I'm trying to remember now. It's been so long since I read anything about it, but I want to say that was the show that was about where the main characters were involved in. They operated a funeral home.
Oh, okay.
And so you had, in a sense, it was like Succession, but these are undertakers rather than multinational executives. So you've got the things that are going on like there, but it falls into that edgy thing. We keep using the word edgy, but that's really the word that they use to describe this situation. But they're doing it in a way that audiences in the 80s and 90s, I don't think, would have ever recognized. They're more existential. They're more surrealistic. They take on these heavy topics. I don't say that they do any of these well, but they take chances in a way that television didn't do before. So if you want to say, what do they mean, just as a collective, what do they mean? Well, it means that TV is capable of doing something different. Do they do it well? Not always. Do they do it sensibly? Well, I think that this fetish, the fetish with the anti-hero shows that they don't always do it sensibly. Are some of these shows too depressing? Yes. Do they present an America that many people are not familiar with? Yes. Is that a good thing? Not usually. It isn't. It can be, but it is presenting something different. And then of course it spawns its own variety of cookie cutters. But I think that's the mark of the drama as we enter the decade and go through it.
But I let me argue against the idea that they're doing something different. If everyone is doing something different, they're just following a trend.
Yes.
If you really want to do something different, because the shows that you mentioned and the other ones, Better Call Saul, Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, Dexter, most of these shows, whether they're prestige or not, are following again these quote dark storylines, characters that are criminals of one sort, whether they're organized criminals, whether they belong to a drug cartel, whether they're a deviant, whether they're the Manson family, whether it's slightly sci-fi-ish with existential horror like Lost, which I think was a big nothing, The Walking Dead, where again we have
Lost,
Romero drama. Why don't we see someone? Because I saw someone wrote here that a reboot of One Day at a Time with a Hispanic family, and I think Rita Moreno might be the grandmother or something in that. I'm not certain, but why don't we see a Hispanic Waltons? Why don't we see a black family like with Christy McNichol back then? If we want to talk about prestige dramas, I want to see not people who have a new serial killer of the week that they're following, the terrorist. I mean, yes, you can have someone who's recurring, like we talked about Hawaii Five-0, the original one, and Wo Fat appeared 7 or 8 times. He was the great nemesis. He was Dr. Moriarty for Jack Lord's Steve, whatever his name was, Steve
McGarrett.
McGarrett, yeah. Okay, I can see it, but it gets fucking boring. This is, I think, one of the reasons that people said that the most realistic cop show ever was Barney Miller.
Yep.
Because you saw Wojciechowicz there typing like me, a two-fingered typist, typing up his reports for Barney. And I'm not saying you have to see people typing or whatnot, but there should be some level of realism if you're calling it a drama. Because if there's not a realism to it, it's melodrama. By definition, melodrama is a drama that is lacking something that literally needs music to guide you along to it. That's the original source of the term. And if you can't portray characters like... I'll give you an example from the 70s that I thought was a very good drama that only lasted a year or so. And that was James at 15 with Lance Kerwin. James at 16. It was, up to that point, I think, the most realistic teen show, or show about a teen, that had ever been to the point. Unfortunately, Lance Kerwin lived a terrible life. He screwed himself. I think he died of an overdose 5-10 years ago. Christy McNichol and the Family Show was good. It introduced the Karate Kid, Machio, there. But these shows, I would say we need Hispanics, we need blacks, we need more diversity. These shows show a slice of real life that if you were to take, for example, Mad Men at its best, or Breaking Bad at its best, and show this to people from another planet, sentient beings, and say, and they would look at this and say, we're not coming to your fucking planet. You're a bunch of psychopaths. But if you showed them, the Waltons, the first 5 seasons especially, if you showed them what were called family dramas, this would say, my guess is they could relate a bit more, because when you see all of these shows trying to outdo each other, on that show I mentioned with Spade, or what the hell is it called? I don't even remember.
The Blacklist.
The Blacklist. Then you get this character that Spader plays, Raymond Reddington, is a great comic character. He's in no way realistic. If you get a chance, look up some of the videos in the next day or two if you have a chance, and you'll see the scenes are wonderful. They're humorous, but they're very 1930s. Who was the big star of the 30s with the mustache? Clark. Yeah, he's sort of like a schlubby Clark Gable in thrust into a crime drama, and it's interesting. But if you watch once you get past the top 8 or 10 2-minute clips, and you see a 5-minute clip or a 6-minute or the 40th clip, you're like, this is kind of repetitive and boring because you know what's going to happen. He enters the room. Some criminal mastermind turns against him. He says a few magical words, and then everyone turns again onto his side. It's like it's being a superhero without having any powers, and it's not realistic. It's not dramatic. It's just ultimately not dramatic.
Yeah. Well, I wrote once that when you look at the cop shows that are on TV, where you're dealing with detectives, particularly, if you get a look at their private lives, which you almost always do, you find them living in downtown condos or places that most people could never afford, and I guarantee you most real life detectives could never afford. If you took the main character from some of these shows and you showed me that they were actually living in a place like that, the first thing I'd be doing is sending them to internal affairs, because they've got to have a secondary source of income that doesn't have anything to do with their job.
Jim Rockford lived in a shitty old trailer.
And and you're right, Rockford
on a beach,
yes,
and I don't think he had electricity all the time.
There was a show called 87th Precinct on in the 1960s. It was based on the Ed McBain stories. And one of their detectives slept on his couch in his apartment because he had a studio. Yeah. A studio apartment. That's all he could afford. So there's that element of realism. But there's another element, and I think this is partly getting to what you were talking about, too, when you're talking about the derivative nature of television. And when they talk about the 2000s and they talk about cutting edge, first place you could argue that a lot of what we're talking about with these dramas actually started with, you could even cite a show like NYPD Blue, which was much more adult than anything that had been on heretofore in terms of what they could show. But so even some of these shows we've talked about were derivative, but at least the original versions of them had some measure of originality to them before they became copied by everybody else. But this other idea is, what does it mean to have an adult show? One of the great adult shows on television was East Side, West Side, with George C. Scott as a social worker. It was too adult. It was so depressing that it never was able to build an audience. It was an uncompromising look at things. It was also a little preachy, but let's set that aside. My point is, that was an adult show. It didn't require profanity. It didn't require nudity, and it didn't require cutting edge storylines ripped from the day's headlines. What it did require was a willingness on the part of the viewer to go out there and look at what the inner city is really like in a lot of cities. That's realism. That's something you don't see on TV very, very often. And that, I would say, was much more of an adult series than the adult shows that we're talking about in the year 2000, because there's a difference between presenting a cutting edge look and presenting an unflinching look. And East Side, West Side was an unflinching look at life in the inner city, and it showed that for the people who had to work within that, it wasn't a very glamorous one. You probably have some experience in that area yourself from what you've done in the past. That I don't know how realistic it was, but the point is that it gave you something you really did not see before. And that is my definition of adult, that it isn't for the whole family, it isn't for children, but it is presenting something that you really have to have an adult intellect to be able to understand, to process, and to take with you after you've watched the show.
1 second. One of my cats is banging to get in. Come on. Stop. Okay, little girl. Okay. But yeah, I think the problem when I see all of these prestige shows that they're lauded is when I watch them. I remember a kid who's that I know now, a young man, told me a few years ago when he watched the first episode of The Sopranos. It opens up with a crime being committed in broad daylight, and I think Tony Soprano just walking away as if nothing's going to happen. It's that these shows, there's that famous trope about, something's about to explode and the hero just calmly walks away and it explodes in the background, whereas in real life he'd be blown 40 feet against a brick wall or something.
He'd be running to get out of there as fast as he could.
Yeah, and you can see that there's that early scene in Goodfellas where the young Ray Liotta character does something similar, and he runs and you see the shock wave actually push him onto the ground. Yeah, and I think it's part of a puerilization, a juvenilization of expectations for adults. Is that, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that this quote cable television dramatic golden age seems to start at about the same time that you had superhero movies in the film world come along. Both of them are equally not real. Now, the characters like this Raymond Reddington, characters like Tony Soprano, characters like Walter White, characters like, pick a half a dozen of your top other sociopaths from that genre, and they're not that different from Thanos or I don't even know the bad guy's name, Thanos, Darkseid, whatever cartoon characters there are.
Not that different from the Joker.
Yeah, the Joker. And I've always thought that Heath Ledger's Joker was way overrated because there's no dramatic substance behind him.
No.
He's just the character literally says at one point, "I'm a force of chaos." Who says that? I mean, but anyway, but both of them. It's easy. I think it's far easier to do a Breaking Bad than to do, say, a Puerto Rican or a Mexican version of Little House on, Little Home in New Mexico. That show about the struggles of, let's say, a migrant family week to week. It could be set in modern life with the ICE. It could be set in the Great Depression. It could be set in the mid-'60s with Cesar Chavez. There's a lot to work for. But that stuff takes time, and it takes real creativity, because having Tony Soprano just make his voice 2 octaves higher and lust after his psychiatrist, that's easy. How many episodes? I only watched maybe a dozen full episodes. I think in 3 or 4 of the episodes, he's talking to his psychologist and imagining her in a hot getup and whatnot. And while that could be funny and effective one time, over and over and over, they lose it. And Walter White diminishes Tony Soprano. Another bad guy like Dexter diminishes Walter White, which diminishes Tony Soprano, because they're not that special.
And you hit on it though, the magic word, Dan, work. That's the problem. It requires work, labor, efforts, creativity, and that you don't. If you just keep copying things, you don't need that. I would argue, I think that you could even see this. You could even, in a sense, call it the Miami Vice effect. When you first started to present television as being style, and the way they dressed, and the music that played in the background, and all these different things that they would encounter. it wasn't what you were saying. The story wasn't nearly as important as how it was presented. And how it was presented had everything to do with how it looked, how it sounded, how it felt. And that, because you're going for feelings, you're not going for thoughts. You're trying to reach them on an emotional impact of the viewer rather than any kind of an intellectual or even just a thought processing impact. So, and you know, you can take it from Miami Vice, and you can go back even farther to any show that you've ever seen that has an opening title sequence where there is more than one main character. They figure out a way to have all the characters walking toward the camera side by side as the credits are running to start the show. When in fact, if you tried to do that in real life, you'd have people pushing them out of the way because they're taking up all the space on the sidewalk. So it's all staging and presentation. And when you use it subtly and when you use it sparingly, it you know, that's the kind of stuff that movie magic is made of, is presentation. But when you start to make everything about presentation and everything about style, including the story itself, and as you say, when you have them walking away from a potential explosion because it looks cooler and you're sacrificing what the real world is like, then you're right, that's not cutting edge, that's lazy.
So let's wrap up here, and if you could just talk about a couple of things, maybe that summarize the decade, or if there's anything that we haven't covered yet and you want to bring up, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that when I come back, when I looked over the show notes again for this and looked at what the predominant theme that I saw was an evolution into what we are beginning to recognize as the beginnings of what we have today. We were starting to see the fragmentation. We were starting to see a move away from network towards cable and pay cable. We were starting to see the niche audience becoming the rule rather than the exception. One thing we did not touch on that I think bears 30 seconds of mentioning is technology. In the year 2000s, we saw high definition TV come on. We saw particularly how that could be used to great effect when covering sports. And you know, the one thing I will say about the 2000s, as far as sports is concerned, is that you had debate television solidified as the main kind of sports programming other than actual sporting events, and you saw the amazing things that could be done on sports with high definition. You also saw that if there was ever any question that the Super Bowl was the dominant cultural event in the country, this is when it became a given that the Super Bowls would all be the highest rated shows in history of American television. So by and large, I think that when we look back at the 2000s from a proper distance, we're not going to remember the shows, as you said at the beginning. We're not going to remember them. We're not going to remember particular trends or particular genres. What we're going to remember is that we're seeing the seeds being planted for what the 2010s and the 2020s will present to us. And if you want to know the basics about TV today, the decade of the 2000s is a great place to start because you can see so much of it right there before you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that I was always engaged by television shows throughout my youth and early adulthood into maybe early middle age. I would have been 35 in 2000. I guess that's early middle age. And yet, within a period of just a few years, virtually every show that I watched on prime time disappeared. The only thing I watch on network television, and I, on a day off like today, I might watch my soap opera General Hospital, but even that I'll sometimes get bits and pieces online, and I think when we talk about like laziness, and I think it became not that it wasn't always about money, but it became more about money and more about money, to the point that, they talk about imitation being the highest form of flattery. I don't, I, once maybe, but the 101st time, it just becomes a way to just milk the system. And
Yeah.
I think the turn of the century, with these technological advances, with half a century or more background to plunder, we started getting Xeroxes of Xeroxes of Xeroxes of Xeroxes in terms of the shows. And because more people are doing these Xeroxes, more of them did make it to television. And, even if you had good actors and some good writing, ultimately the weight of that laziness, the weight of that lack of innovation, took its toll. So it'll be interesting when in a few months we'll do the next decade, because I'm even more a babe in the woods in the 20 teens. But it was another good show, and we'll be back not with another decade. I don't know what we'll do. We'll see what we'll do come March. But
stay tuned. We'll be surprised just like you are.
So. All right. Take care.
Okay.